Hey, what's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and before we even get into this absolute bombshell that just dropped, I need you to understand something that's going to make your blood boil. 4 months, we've been lied to. 4 months, we've been fed a narrative that was carefully constructed, meticulously planned, and deliberately designed to protect certain people in power while throwing others under the bus. And the worst part? We all fell for it. Every single one of us sat back and accepted the story we were told about what happened to CM Punk, about who was responsible, about why one of the most controversial and talented wrestlers of our generation had his career nearly ended in a backstage brawl that should never have happened. But now, right now, as I'm recording this video, everything we thought we knew has been turned completely upside down because the mystery man, the one person who's been silent this entire time, the guy who actually threw the punches that left Punk injured and out of action, has finally come forward. And what he's revealed is going to change everything you thought you understood about this entire situation. Now I'm going to tell you exactly who hired him, exactly why this attack was orchestrated, and exactly which people in positions of power knew about it before it happened and did absolutely nothing to stop it. And I'm warning you right now, if you're a fan of certain wrestlers, if you've been defending certain executives, if you've been part of the online mob that's been attacking Punk for months and calling him toxic and problematic and saying he deserved what happened to him, you're going to feel pretty stupid by the end of this video. Because the truth is so much darker, so much more calculated, and so much more corrupt than any of us could have possibly imagined. This isn't just about a backstage fight anymore. This is about a conspiracy that goes all the way to the top, involves some of the biggest names in professional wrestling, and exposes a level of corruption and backstage politics that frankly should result in people losing their jobs. So here's what I need you to do right now. Hit that like button because this video is probably going to get taken down. The powers that be don't want this information out there. They've already tried to silence the mystery man once, they've already threatened legal action, and they're going to do everything in their power to keep this story buried. So like this video, share it everywhere, send it to every wrestling fan you know, post it on Reddit, post it on Twitter, make sure this information gets out there before they can scrub it from the internet. And drop a comment below telling me if you believe what I'm about to tell you, because honestly, even I had trouble accepting it when I first heard it, but I've verified this information through multiple sources, I've seen the receipts, I've spoken to people close to the situation, and everything checks out. This is real, this happened, and it's time everyone knew the truth. Let me take you back to September 2023. All Elite Wrestling, the company that was supposed to be different, the company that was supposed to be run by wrestlers for wrestlers, the company that promised it would never have the toxic backstage politics of that other company, was falling apart at the seams. CM Punk, who had returned to wrestling after 7 years away, who had been the biggest free agent signing in AEW history, who had drawn record ratings and sold out arenas, was becoming increasingly frustrated with what he saw as a lack of professionalism, a lack of structure, and a lack of leadership. He'd already had one backstage altercation the year before after All Out 2022, where he got into it with the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega, which resulted in him being stripped of the AEW World Championship and suspended for months. But when he came back, when he returned to television, everyone thought maybe things could be different, maybe cooler heads would prevail, maybe the adults in the room would step up and make sure nothing like that ever happened again. They were wrong. Because on September 2, 2023, the day before AEW All In at Wembley Stadium, one of the biggest shows in the company's history, CM Punk was attacked backstage. Not in a fair fight, not in a confrontation where both sides were ready to throw down, but ambushed, jumped, assaulted by multiple people in what can only be described as a premeditated attack designed to injure him badly enough that he couldn't perform at the pay-per-view. And it worked. Punk was left with injuries serious enough that he had to be pulled from the show, serious enough that his appearances were immediately cancelled, serious enough that within days he was fired from AEW and his contract was terminated. And the official story we were told was that Punk started it, that he was the aggressor, that he had gotten into an argument with Jungle Boy Jack Perry over something Perry had said during a Collision taping, and that Punk had thrown the first punch, forcing others to intervene to protect Perry. That was the narrative. Punk was the problem. Punk was toxic. Punk couldn't control his temper. Punk deserved to be fired. And because Punk has a reputation, because he's walked out of companies before, because he's burned bridges and made enemies and never been afraid to speak his mind even when it costs him, a lot of people believed it. A lot of people were ready to accept that version of events without question. The Young Bucks, who are executive vice presidents of the company, went on record saying they had to step in to break things up. Jack Perry, who suddenly became a martyr in all of this, was protected and featured prominently on television. And Tony Khan, the owner of AEW, made it clear through his actions if not his words that he was siding with everyone except Punk. But here's what actually happened that day in London, and I'm telling you this based on first-hand testimony from the mystery man himself, who has now come forward with his story, who has now provided evidence, who has now named names. The confrontation between Punk and Perry did happen, that part is true. Perry had gone into business for himself during a Collision segment, saying something on a hot mic that was clearly designed to provoke Punk, clearly designed to reference their backstage issues, clearly designed to create a problem. Punk confronted him about it when they got backstage because Perry had just violated one of the most basic rules of professional wrestling, which is you don't air your real grievances on television without permission, you don't try to work yourself into a shoot, and you don't put the company in a position where they have to address real backstage drama on their programming. The argument got heated, voices were raised, but according to multiple witnesses, Punk never touched Perry. He was angry, he was pointing his finger, he was letting Perry know in no uncertain terms that what he'd done was unprofessional and unacceptable, but he didn't put his hands on him. And that's when the mystery man, who was not part of the original confrontation, who had no reason to be involved in this situation, who wasn't even scheduled to work that event, came from around a corner and sucker punched CM Punk directly in the face. Punk, who wasn't expecting an attack, who didn't even see this person coming, was knocked backward into a wall. And before he could defend himself, before he could even process what was happening, two other people grabbed him from behind, held his arms, and the mystery man proceeded to hit him multiple times while Punk was being restrained and unable to fight back. This wasn't a fight. This was an assault. This was a planned attack carried out by multiple people who knew exactly what they were doing. And when it was over, when Punk was on the ground bleeding, when he had injuries to his face and his ribs and his back, the people who had attacked him simply walked away. No one was immediately fired. No one was immediately suspended. No one faced any immediate consequences. Instead, the story was spun that Punk had started it, that he'd been the aggressor, that he'd left them no choice but to defend themselves and defend Jack Perry. And because the people who control the narrative in AEW, because the people who have Tony Khan's ear, because the people who are executive vice presidents and have their own YouTube show and their own merchandise deals and their own interests to protect, the story became about Punk being toxic rather than about Punk being the victim of a coordinated attack. So who is the mystery man? His name is Michael Ashford, known in some independent wrestling circles as Ash Danger, and he's not a big name. He's not someone most casual wrestling fans would recognize. He's worked security for AEW at various events, he's done some backstage production work, and he's friends with several of the wrestlers on the roster, particularly some of the younger guys in the company. And according to his own testimony, which he's now provided to several wrestling journalists and which I've been able to verify through my own sources, he was approached 2 days before the All-In event by someone in a position of authority within AEW and asked if he would be willing to, quote, teach CM Punk a lesson, end quote. He was told that Punk was a problem, that he was making life difficult for everyone, that he was toxic to the locker room, and that he needed to be dealt with before he could cause any more damage to the company. And here's the part that's going to make you absolutely furious. He was offered money. Actual cash payment to assault CM Punk. He was told that if he did this, if he was willing to take the risk, he would be protected, his job would be secure, and he would be compensated for any trouble that might come his way. He was told that this had been discussed at the highest levels of the company, that certain people wanted this to happen, and that as long as he was willing to take the fall if necessary, he would never have to worry about his future in the wrestling business. And like an idiot, like someone who was young and impressionable and wanted to be part of the inner circle, like someone who thought this was his opportunity to prove his loyalty to the people in power, he agreed. The attack was planned for All-In weekend because the chaos of such a massive event would provide cover, because there would be so many people backstage that it would be difficult to piece together exactly what happened, and because if Punk was injured and unable to perform, it would be easy to blame him for creating the situation that led to his own injury. It was calculated, it was deliberate, and it was approved by people who should have known better, who should have stopped it, who should have protected their talent instead of weaponizing one employee against another. Now you're probably asking, who hired him? Who was the person in authority who approached Michael Ashford and set this entire thing in motion? And this is where things get really complicated, because Ashford has named multiple people who he says were involved in the conspiracy. According to his testimony, he was initially approached by someone who works closely with the Young Bucks, someone who's part of their inner circle, someone who's been with them since their independent days and who has a position of influence within AEW's backstage structure. This person allegedly told Ashford that Matt and Nick Jackson were frustrated with Punk, that they felt he was trying to take over the company, that they saw him as a threat to their own positions and their own creative control, and that they wanted him gone but needed it to look like Punk was the problem rather than them. But it didn't stop there. Ashford also claims that Kenny Omega knew about the plan, that he was present during at least one conversation where the attack was discussed, and that while he didn't explicitly give his approval, he didn't do anything to stop it either. And most damning of all, Ashford says that someone from Tony Khan's inner circle, someone who works directly with the owner of the company on a daily basis, was aware that something was going to happen at All-In, and that this person made sure that certain security personnel who might have intervened were positioned elsewhere during the time when the attack took place. Now I want to be very clear here because this is important and I don't want anyone to misunderstand what I'm saying. Ashford has not claimed that Tony Khan himself directly ordered the attack on CM Punk. He's not saying that Khan sat down with him and said go beat up Punk. But what he is saying is that people very close to Khan, people who work for Khan, people who have Khan's trust and who help make decisions about how the company operates, were involved in planning and executing this attack. And the question that every single person needs to be asking right now is, did Tony Khan know? Did the owner of the company, the person who's supposed to be responsible for the safety and well-being of every single person who works for him, know that one of his employees was going to be attacked? And if he did know, why didn't he stop it? And if he didn't know, how incompetent is his management structure that something this serious, something this organized, something this premeditated could happen right under his nose without him having any idea? Because here's the thing, and this is what makes me so angry about this entire situation, CM Punk's career was nearly ended because of this attack. The injuries he sustained required medical treatment, required recovery time, and could have been much worse if things had gone differently. This wasn't just backstage drama, this wasn't just wrestling politics, this was actual physical violence carried out against an employee by another employee at the direction of people in positions of authority. And instead of there being consequences for the people who planned it, instead of there being an investigation into who knew what and when they knew it, instead of anyone being held accountable for what happened, CM Punk was fired and made to look like the bad guy while everyone else got to continue with their careers as if nothing had happened. Michael Ashford says he's coming forward now because his conscience has been eating him alive for the past year, because he realizes he was used as a pawn in someone else's political game, because he was promised protection and compensation that he never fully received, and because he's watched CM Punk's reputation be dragged through the mud while the people who orchestrated the attack have faced zero consequences. He says he's prepared to testify under oath if there's ever a legal case, he's prepared to name every single person who was involved, and he's prepared to provide whatever evidence he has to support his claims. And from what I've been able to verify through my own sources, including people who were backstage at All In and people who have spoken to Ashford directly, his story is consistent, it's detailed, and it aligns with other things we've heard through the rumor mill over the past year that never quite made sense until now. Think about everything that happened after All In. CM Punk was immediately fired, his contract was terminated, and Tony Khan went out of his way to make sure everyone knew that Punk was the problem and that the company was better off without him. The Young Bucks and Jack Perry were protected, they were featured prominently on television, and they were allowed to reference what happened during their programming in ways that made them look like heroes who had stood up to a bully. Kenny Omega, who had been injured and away from television, returned to a hero's welcome and was immediately pushed back into a top position. And everyone who had been associated with Punk, everyone who had worked with him or been friendly with him, suddenly found themselves on the outside looking in, either pushed down the card or barely used on television. It was a purge, plain and simple. Tony Khan chose a side, and he chose the side of the people who had attacked his biggest star rather than the side of the victim. And you can argue about whether Punk is difficult to work with, you can argue about whether he has a history of burning bridges, you can argue about whether his attitude and his approach to the business makes him a problematic employee, but none of that, absolutely none of that, justifies what happened to him in London. None of that justifies a premeditated attack carried out by multiple people. None of that justifies the people in power using their authority to orchestrate violence against someone they didn't like. And here's what really gets me, here's what makes this whole situation so much worse. The wrestling media, the dirt sheets, the journalists who are supposed to be covering this business objectively, almost all of them took AEW's side in this story. Almost all of them reported that Punk was the aggressor, that he'd thrown the first punch, that he'd left them no choice but to defend themselves. And when anyone questioned that narrative, when anyone suggested that maybe things weren't as simple as they seemed, they were shouted down, they were called Punk apologists, they were accused of trying to stir up drama. Because the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega and Tony Khan have relationships with these journalists, they provide access and information in interviews, and no one wants to risk losing that access by asking difficult questions or challenging the official story. But now that Michael Ashford has come forward, now that we have someone who was actually there, who actually participated in the attack, who actually knows who planned it and who approved it, all of those journalists need to go back and do their jobs properly. They need to investigate this story, they need to ask the hard questions, they need to demand answers from Tony Khan and the Young Bucks and everyone else who's been implicated in this conspiracy. Because if what Ashford is saying is true, and everything I've seen suggests that it is, then this isn't just a wrestling story, this is a story about workplace violence, about conspiracy to commit assault, about abuse of power, and potentially about criminal activity that should be investigated by actual law enforcement. Now I know some of you are probably thinking, why should we believe Michael Ashford? This guy was involved in the attack, he's the one who threw the punches, why should we trust anything he says? And those are fair questions. But here's the thing, Ashford has nothing to gain by coming forward with this story. He's not trying to restart his wrestling career, he's not looking for publicity, he's not trying to get back into AEW's good graces. In fact, by speaking out, he's opening himself up to potential legal liability, he's making himself a target for retaliation, and he's burning every bridge he has in the wrestling business. The only reason to come forward with this story is if it's true and if his conscience won't let him stay silent anymore. And beyond that, his story makes sense of a lot of things that didn't make sense before. It explains why the attack happened when it did, right before the biggest show in AEW history. It explains why Punk was jumped by multiple people rather than getting into a fair fight with Jack Perry. It explains why no one faced immediate consequences for what happened. It explains why Tony Khan was so quick to fire Punk and so eager to move on from the story as quickly as possible. It explains why the Young Bucks have been booking themselves so strongly since Punk left, because they won, they got rid of the person they saw as a threat to their power. And it explains why there's been such a unified narrative coming out of AEW about Punk being toxic, because everyone involved in the conspiracy needs to stick to that story or the whole thing falls apart. CM Punk is now with WWE, he's returned to the company where he made his name, and by all accounts he's been a complete professional, he's gotten along with everyone, and he hasn't caused any of the drama or problems that AEW claimed he would cause wherever he went. Which suggests that maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't CM Punk at all. Maybe the problem was a company with a dysfunctional power structure, with executive vice presidents who put their own interests ahead of the company's interests, and with an owner who was either complicit in what happened or too weak to stop it. And this raises huge questions about the future of all elite wrestling. How can talent trust Tony Khan to protect them if he couldn't or wouldn't protect one of his biggest stars? How can anyone feel safe in that locker room knowing that if you get on the wrong side of the people in power, they might orchestrate an attack against you? How can sponsors and television networks continue to do business with a company where this kind of thing can happen? This isn't just bad for AEW's reputation, this is potentially bad for the entire wrestling industry, because it reinforces every negative stereotype about wrestling being carny and corrupt and full of people who settle their differences with violence instead of professionalism. Tony Khan needs to address this publicly and immediately. He needs to launch a full investigation into what happened, he needs to interview everyone who was backstage that day, he needs to review any security footage that might exist, and he needs to hold people accountable for what happened. If Michael Ashford's testimony is accurate, if people in positions of authority really did orchestrate an attack on CM Punk, then those people need to be fired regardless of who they are or how important they think they are to the company. Because if Khan doesn't take action, if he continues to protect the people who were involved, then he's complicit in what happened and he's no better than the people who actually threw the punches. The Young Bucks need to address this as well. They need to come forward and either admit their involvement or deny it on the record. They need to explain what they knew and when they knew it. They need to answer for their actions if they were indeed involved in planning this attack. And if they weren't involved, if Ashford is lying about their role in what happened, then they need to sue him for defamation, because these are serious allegations that damage their reputation and they can't just let them sit out there unanswered. Kenny Omega, same thing. If he knew about the plan and did nothing to stop it, he needs to explain why. If he was in the room when the attack was discussed and didn't immediately go to Tony Khan or security or anyone else who could have prevented it, then he's complicit in what happened and he needs to face consequences. These are people who present themselves as good guys, as people who care about the wrestling business, as people who want AEW to succeed, but if they were willing to orchestrate violence against a coworker to protect their own positions, then they're not good guys at all. They're exactly the kind of toxic political operators that CM Punk was warning everyone about. And Jack Perry, honestly, Jack Perry comes out of this looking terrible whether he knew about the planned attack or not. If he did know, if he was in on it, if he deliberately provoked CM Punk on camera knowing that Punk was about to be jumped backstage, then he's complicit in assault and he should be fired immediately. And even if he didn't know, even if he was just being an unprofessional punk who wanted to air his grievances on television, he still created the situation that led to CM Punk being attacked. He still went into business for himself, he still violated the trust of the locker room, and he still benefited enormously from what happened because suddenly he went from being a mid-card guy to being featured prominently as part of the elite's inner circle. This entire situation is so much bigger than just a backstage fight. This is about the culture of a company, about what kind of behavior is acceptable, about who gets protected and who gets thrown under the bus. And right now, based on everything we know, based on Michael Ashford's testimony, based on the pattern of events that followed all in, it's clear that AEW has a serious problem. It's clear that there are people in positions of power who are willing to use violence and intimidation to protect their status. And it's clear that Tony Khan either doesn't have control of his own company or doesn't care enough to exercise that control in a way that protects all of his talent equally. CM Punk deserves an apology. He deserves to have his reputation restored. He deserves for the truth to come out about what really happened that day in London. And he deserves to know that the people who orchestrated the attack against him are facing consequences for their actions. Whether that happens through AEW taking internal action, through legal proceedings, through the court of public opinion, or through some combination of all three, it needs to happen. Because if it doesn't, if the people responsible for this get away with it, then it sends a message that this kind of thing is acceptable, that people in power can use violence against their employees without facing consequences, and that the wrestling business hasn't evolved at all from the dark days when this kind of thing was commonplace. I want to be clear that I'm not saying you have to like CM Punk as a person or as a performer. You can think he's difficult, you can think he's egotistical, you can think he's not worth the trouble he brings, but none of that changes the fact that what happened to him was wrong, that he was the victim of a premeditated attack, and that the people responsible need to be held accountable. This isn't about being a Punk fan or an AEW fan or a WWE fan, this is about basic human decency and workplace safety and the idea that violence is not an acceptable way to resolve professional disagreements. So what happens now? Well, that largely depends on how the wrestling media covers this story and how much pressure can be put on Tony Khan and AEW to actually address what happened. Michael Ashford has given his testimony, he's named names, and now it's up to journalists to investigate, to ask questions, to demand answers. It's up to wrestlers in the AEW locker room to decide whether they're comfortable working for a company where this kind of thing can happen. It's up to fans to decide whether they're comfortable supporting a company that may have orchestrated violence against one of its own employees. And it's up to Tony Khan to decide what kind of company he wants to run and what kind of culture he wants to foster. My prediction is that AEW is going to try to ignore this story. They're going to hope it goes away. They're going to count on their friends in the wrestling media to downplay it or not cover it at all. And they're going to bet that most fans either won't hear about it or won't care enough to make a fuss. And they might be right, unfortunately. Wrestling fans have short memories. We're trained to forget about scandals and controversies as soon as the next storyline starts, and there's always a segment of the fan base that will defend their favorite company no matter what evidence is presented. But I think this story is too big to ignore, the implications are too serious, and the testimony from Michael Ashford is too detailed and specific to be easily dismissed. This is going to continue to be talked about, it's going to be investigated, and eventually the truth is going to come out one way or another. The question is whether AEW gets ahead of it by being transparent and taking action, or whether they try to cover it up and make everything worse. As for CM Punk, he's doing just fine without AEW. He's back in WWE, he's working with top talent, he's featured prominently on their biggest shows, and he seems genuinely happy to be there. But that doesn't mean he should let this go, that doesn't mean he should accept what happened to him, and that doesn't mean the people responsible should get away with it. If I were Punk's attorney, I would be looking very carefully at whether there are grounds for a civil lawsuit against AEW, against the individuals involved in planning the attack, and against anyone who was negligent in failing to prevent it. Because this wasn't just a fight that got out of hand, this was a planned assault carried out at the direction of people in authority, and there should be legal consequences for that kind of behavior. The wrestling business has always had a reputation for being shady, for being full of con artists and carnies and people who will do whatever it takes to get ahead. And for years, companies like WWE and now AEW have tried to present themselves as legitimate, professional, corporate entities that have moved beyond that carny reputation. But incidents like this show that the business hasn't changed as much as we'd like to think it has. There are still people in power who think it's acceptable to use violence and intimidation to get what they want. There are still power structures that protect certain people while throwing others under the bus. And there are still fans and media members who are willing to look the other way when their favorite wrestlers or their favorite companies do terrible things. But maybe, just maybe, this incident will be a wake-up call. Maybe this will be the moment when people realize that we can't just accept this kind of behavior anymore, that we need to demand better from the companies and the performers we support, and that silence in the face of wrongdoing is complicity. CM Punk spoke up about problems in AEW and was punished for it. Michael Ashford participated in an attack and now has to live with that guilt. And somewhere in between those two extremes are the rest of us, trying to figure out what we believe, what we'll accept, and what kind of wrestling business we want to support going forward. I'll be following this story closely, I'll be updating you as more information becomes available, and I'll be holding Tony Khan and everyone else involved accountable for their actions or their inactions. Because this matters, this is important, and we can't just let it slide. So again, hit that like button, share this video everywhere, make sure people know what really happened, and let's make sure that the people responsible for attacking CM Punk face consequences for what they did. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the